a lot of the things that you guys have been talking about, even yesterday on the field trips, really speak to some of the things that we've been thinking about as we've been doing this modeling study. And I really want to point out that this was, even though I was the PI on this project, 100% of the simulations that were run by Zachary Robbins, who's a PhD student. Well, he actually just graduated. He's now Dr. Robbins. But he was an amazingly productive PhD student, and we're about to push out 3 publications on this work. So I'll actually be showing you simulations and modeling work that we've been working on since basically 2016, right? So it's an enormous amount of work that he's done. And also Rob Scheller, he is his advisor at NC State. He is also the developer of the model Landis-2 that we'll talk about today. So really good collaborators, and there's a lot of other people involved along the way, which we'll talk about at the end. So I don't think I need to talk about this too much. Everybody knows what happened in 2016. But a couple of people kind of pointed out that, is this an anomaly or is this actually a glimpse into the future? And I would guess that most of you think that it's a glimpse into the future, right? And what are those ecological implications of our novel fire conditions in what we really would consider a novel forest, right? And how do we actually manage, in these forests? And so one thing I want you guys to, it was really great that Marcus actually went before me, because he really had this sort of global, regional perspective, and I want you to kind of keep that same mindset as I'm going through these slides, because this model was actually run across this entire region here in the black outline. So it's about 8.5 million acres, and we simulated it with this model called Landis-2, which we'll talk about. And here what we did was, this is a map of just some of the areas that we use for information input into the model, specifically for mortality estimates. Okay, so when we're thinking about ecological models, it can be sort of very daunting to think about what you're actually thinking about and what needs to be simulated into the models. And I'll tell you, it is very intensive. So we have to basically understand, what the characteristics of the forest, what species are involved, what soils are involved, and understanding disturbances, and especially those disturbances that we know occur in the forest that might actually occur later. And then, of course, the ecosystem processes, right? Thinking about like carbon and nitrogen cycling, those things are all very important. Okay, so models are really awesome because once we input information about what we know about the past and also what's happening right now, we can start using projections and do scenario testing within the model, right? We can say, okay, if we manage this particular way, how does it affect our forest into the future? Okay, so understanding the forest a little bit more. So within this model, we input different things like, let's say, growth and yield, different tree characteristics, are they evergreens, are they deciduous, what kind of carbon-nitrogen ratios do they have, regeneration patterns, things like that. What are their mortality rates, and regeneration, of course. And then we have maps of species distributions. We typically get from like FIA data or any type of remote sensing that we might have. And of course, and then ecosystem processes. Again, we incorporate such things like spatial and temporal soils and climate regions and climate dynamics. And sort of exchange rates. What is the actual flux of nutrients in and out of those systems? And of course, understanding disturbances. A lot of times we use data from plot measurements or remote sensing, and even maps of fire spread to calibrate the model. And so the model that I'm talking about is Landis-2. It is a spatially and temporally explicit model. Okay, so that means it's actually spatially interactive, and it simulates it over time. And so each cell in it, okay, so if you're thinking about an image and you think about a pixel, so within each one of those pixels is a forested stand. And so you have multiple species. Landis 2 actually runs with what they call age cohorts. Because it's run at such a large scale, that instead of doing individual species, we do age cohorts of the species. And it makes it a little bit more computationally easier to run. And so for each species, we'll have like growth and mortality, competition, reproduction that occur within those cells. And spatially and temporally, they'll actually have responses to climate, including drought, soil characteristics, light environment, if you think about regeneration, and also, of course, various types of disturbances. And so it allows actually for the occurrence and the spread of these different disturbances across a landscape. And as you can imagine, there's an enormous amount of information that goes into this. And so this is just one slide on all the nitty-gritty on what occurs with how we might simulate fire and fire effects in Landis 2. And we can have explicit ignitions from lightning and from accidental human-caused and also prescribed fire. So those all can be simulated spatially and temporally. And the fire spread is associated with, so if a fire actually ignites, you know, what's the weather, topography, wind, fuels, all those things that we think about associated with fire. And we can incorporate fire suppression maps, and this is based on actually what we know on where fire suppression occurs, but it's mainly based on suppression difficulty, like can we actually access the area, so like distance to roads and different types of resources. And then prescribed fire is where we know where the prescribed fire actually occurs. And so we know things about like fire rotation, and then we use remote sensing to understand intensity and severity, and also field data. And fire effects is associated with severity, so it's a likelihood based on intensity and the actual response that we know that species might have. And so this is all data-driven. So one thing we wanted to look at, which we thought was really interesting, was the effects of delayed mortality, which we talked a lot about today. I really don't have to read any of that because everybody knows what we've been talking about. And so we thought, okay, well, what if we actually run this model and simulate what we might have collected from that first year after a burn versus what we might collect several years after the fire, right? Because those are really, as we've seen, very different values. And so the first step of our project was, okay, so once we parameterized Landis 2, which is quite a task in itself, we used two scenarios of fire response. So we used this sort of immediate mortality and delayed mortality. We had information at this time up to about 3 years, up to about 2019 of post-fire data. And we simulated fire and post-fire succession using Landis 2, and looking at the long-term ecological impacts between the scenarios. Okay, so this is just a quick, I don't expect you to, totally absorb this, but the idea is just to show you that these are the differences that we're seeing between if we just incorporated what we saw 1 year after the fire versus what we saw incorporated sort of delayed mortality with these species. This is both including field data and remote sensing. And so what we saw here was that, so here we're looking at the differences between delayed and immediate mortality when we're looking at just the biomass that's actually removed from the fire in the model. And this is, if we incorporate delayed mortality, I think I have, yeah. So we're actually getting a 20% difference in the biomass removed across the entire landscape, just incorporating the effects of delayed mortality. And if we're looking at the actual stem mortality, you get a 60% difference in what we're seeing across the area. Okay, so just what we did see from this was, okay, so the question is, was delayed mortality important for long-term landscape simulations? And the short answer is yes. Incorporating delayed mortality increased basically light for regeneration. We did see that. And it also included more mortality of, the oaks, hickories, and pines, which is, of course, contrary a little bit to the fire resilience, but it was important to incorporate those because we know it actually occurs on the landscape. And of course, this influenced their regeneration potential, because if those trees perished, right, you don't have the nurse trees. But the effects were local. And so when you look at it, because there's not, you're thinking about the grand scale of things, when you're thinking about 8.5 million hectares, and you're looking at averages, through time. So this is simulated over the next 80 years. It really, the effects were very local. Okay, and so so it really turns out that fire frequency and occurrence was still the sort of major driver of the dynamics across the entire landscape. Okay, so the second direction we took, we said, okay, well, we really want to see the impacts of climate change. So we know that both long-term drought trend and increases in variability of that drought can alter future fire, right? And we especially learned that from the 2016 wildfires. So we said, okay, well, let's look at these different GCMs, which are the global circulation models, right? So these different climate change models. And so we looked at models with high or low drought trends, and also models with high or low drought variability. Okay, so I kind of just put these here as, minimal change in drought trend, minimal change in drought variability, all the way down to maximal change. And to look at that in a little more detail, so this is simulations that were done through time in the next 80 years. These are hectares, so I use a metric here, but hectares burned per decade. And this is using the, so this sort of, it's a little hard to see, but there's kind of an orange line down there, which is like the historical climate. So historical climate is like the past 30-year distribution. And if we just incorporate a minimal drought and minimal variability in that drought, you see about a 3 to 4 degree increase in temperature. The precipitation was kind of like the historical, and the fire was roughly about the same. And if you begin to increase that temperature a little bit, and your precipitation slightly increases, you actually get a 40% increase in fire. This is through the 80 years. And if you are looking at higher temperatures, but your precipitation is relatively steady, then you get a 100% increase in fire, which is pretty, so you're actually doubling your fire. But what's really interesting about our simulations is this one. So the variability of drought, okay, not just the increase in drought, but the variability in drought was the biggest driver and the impact of fires that were simulated with this model. So 500% increase in fire. Okay. So here we have those same 4 different simulations, right? And I kind of just wrote it here so you can kind of look at this as, minimal change in drought trend, minimal change in drought variability, and so this is minimal change in drought trend, but high change in variability. And these are all the fires that occurred across that 80-year simulation. Okay, so they're just like piled on top of each other, right, through time. And so some things to kind of point out here is, first of all, in the more sort of contiguous areas where there is less suppression efforts, because remember, there's actually maps of suppression, and is where you're seeing most of the fire occurrence and these really short fire return intervals. So just repeated wildfires that would occur. And another thing to also point out is that there's actually more that occurs because the climate is also spatially explicit. So at those southern ends of southern Appalachians, there's a little bit higher temperature and sort of variability. And so there's actually more of an effect towards the southern end of the Appalachians, which is kind of where we are. And then, of course, with the high variability, what's happening here is, so one thing to also remember is that the prescribed fire regime stays the same during these simulations. And also, the ignitions stay the same during all of this. So, so here, what's happening here is that the fire spread is basically going beyond those areas. Like, it's getting more and more difficult to suppress those fires kind of through time. Because you're assuming also that suppression is the same also through the models. Okay, so how does this change a little bit? So, in this model we simulated, I think it was like 48 species, but just to look at some groupings of some of these, because it's kind of hard to look at like a million different graphs of species kind of through time, is we said, okay, well, what is the percent of stand biomass of some different functional groups? And so here, just comparing xeric white species, you get an increase as you have lower fire return intervals, and that does include prescribed fire. And then the opposite is true for your music maples. But what's interesting is you almost kind of stay the same with these hardwoods that are kind of in between, right, on how sensitive they are to fire. Okay, and so for our third portion of the project, we said, okay, well, given future change, how can we manage these landscapes? How can we continue to prevent wildfire spillover into the WUI? And how can we have enough fire in the landscape to encourage more fire resilience and oak regeneration? And so this is where it gets really tricky. You thought, 4 climate change scenarios is tricky. This is when it really gets tricky, okay? Because everything multiplies, right? So if you have 4 different climate change scenarios and they have 4 management scenarios, you can have 16 different combinations. And so you have to always narrow down what type of, simulations or questions you kind of want to ask, because it gets complicated really quickly. So it's fun to think of, all these different scenarios, but we always have to narrow it down. Okay, so I'll go a little bit more into the different types of management activity that we did. We decided to stick with the minimal drought but high variability simulation, and as business as usual, okay, based on historical data. Okay. So we ran 2 scenarios of ignitions. One of them is what we know now about ignitions across the landscape, and also a 50% reduction in human accidental conditions or ignitions. And this is kind of based on the thought that, and some people actually brought this up today, was if we're able to educate the public or even like increase surveillance of fire, if we were able to reduce ignitions by 50%. Because we know what's going to happen if we increase the ignitions, right? So, all right, so prescribed burning. So this green line here shows us what we're basically, this is the prescribed fire that's happening now. And that's actually simulated across those 80 years. And then what's currently planned based on national forest plans, we call that this sort of like 100% prescribed burning that we're going to do. And then we ran another scenario of doubling the current plan. Okay, so 200% of prescribed fire plans. So I'm actually curious, Gary, where we kind of land here with the five times prescribed burning. I would say we're probably right there somewhere, with the 5 times. So, okay. All right, fire suppression scenarios. Again, if you're thinking about how many scenarios we're getting into here. Currently parameterized fire suppression, business as usual. And we decided to look at this a little bit more spatially. Okay, so if we get a 50% increase in WUI suppression, okay, just along the WUI areas, 50% increase in wildland suppression only. So these 2 should say only, WUI only, wildland suppression only increase. But then, and also putting those 2 together, so 50% increase in the wildland and the WUI suppression. We following? There's a lot of scenarios, okay? Okay. So let's go through this just a little bit here. So first, wait, I'm going to go back a second. Let's just think about what this graph is telling us. So these are the reduction in WUI hectares burned across the landscape. Okay, so reduction. And this is compared to the business as usual scenario. All right? So I'm going to walk you through this a little bit, because there's a lot. This took me a while to just sit and look at this graph. So if you do full suppression, so that's, I'm going to go back here. So this is this last one, both wildland and WUI suppression. Okay, you get a, I think it's a, yeah, wait. You get the most reduced fire encroachment in the WUI the most. Okay, that's not really surprising, right? We're just out there just putting everything out, right? Okay, but if you have 50% ignition reduction, reduced fire encroachment by about 30% into the WUI. If you only are doubling prescribed burning, okay, so this is not changing your suppression tactics. If the only thing you're gonna do is double, that's the 200% one, you get about a 10% reduction in fire encroachment into the WUI. It's not all bad news, I promise. Okay, so thinking about oak regeneration, I'm gonna step you through this graph as well. Okay, so young oak biomass, this is a percent increase in biomass compared to the business as usual. So the graphs here that are solid are just looking at the effects of suppression and the 100% prescribed burning. And then the hashed ones here are looking at 200% prescribed burning in the different suppression, right? So you get full suppression here in the wildlands and in the, again, along the WUI, and then separated out into wildland and WUI. Okay, so first of all, increasing prescribed fire could increase oak regeneration by 60%. Okay, so that's this graph right here. 200% increase in prescribed fire could increase oak regeneration by another 30%. Okay, the next thing we see here is increasing, so what's interesting here is that increasing suppression, all right, so we're getting kind of a reduction here. If you compare it to these two, you get a little bit of a reduction in oak regeneration, right, because there's less fire. But this is offset with increasing your prescribed fire by 200%, or could be offset. All right, so wrapping it all up, so delayed mortality impacts older cohorts of all the species, but it's particularly for older and known fire-resistant ones. Drought variability seems to be an important driver, maybe the important driver of a fire regime, particularly in the high emissions climate projections. So national forests and parks may experience the biggest increase in wildfires, but implementation of prescribed fire and reduced ignitions can mitigate these increases. Decreased fire return interval, okay, so more fire, increased oak prevalence and reduced music species, but was typically not sufficient enough to restore to historical conditions, right? And we're thinking about really historical conditions, or reverse musification. I've heard people, not this week, but I've heard other people talk about reverse musification, you know, regardless of the scenario that we're implementing, which is probably not a surprise to anybody. Increased fire suppression was definitely necessary with increased WUI, but increasing prescribed fire was able to more than offset the loss of oak regeneration that wildfire could cause. And both increasing suppression and increasing prescribed fire could optimize the conditions in our managed landscapes. So I also want to tell you that we're not done. We're continuing our modeling efforts, and Katie McQuillan will talk a little bit about her work tomorrow. But to shout out to some other people, we've got Kate Jones. She's doing some really interesting work. I know she's reached out to several of you here to get very detailed management input on where, sort of picking out areas, in the southern Alps to focus on. And actually linking that information to V-smoke to determine where smoke and expanding WUI will interact, which I think is really interesting. And then Andrew Shannon just started his work doing most of his focus on Bent Creek, but assessing sub-canopy solar radiation, on sort of looking at those favorable conditions for oak regeneration, and using these data to even better calibrate Landis-2 and study drought resilience and carbon flux. Well, thank you so much. Here is Zach. He actually just chopped off his hair. I couldn't get a more recent picture of him. And Rob Scheller. Zach is actually now at Los Alamos National Lab as a postdoc, but we're still working on collaborations. And these are the papers. This one's in press, and these other ones, this one's in review, and this one we're going to submit this summer.